Welcome everybody back to the second impromptu emergency PHLY Sixers podcast. I am once again Derek Bodner, joined by Kyle Neubeck once again. I think that's where I was going with that one. Sorry, we're a little disheveled right now. How you doing, Kyle?
I would say, just like Michael Jordan in the NBA Finals, I had a bad thing of pizza last night, so I have felt better. I have definitely felt better, and just like a lot of Philadelphia right now, I am dubious of the path forward for the Philadelphia 76ers, but we're here to.
I'm pretty confident on the path forward. It's just not the path that we want it to be. So the news of the day and why we were all scrambling to do a podcast: the Celtics traded for Jrue Holiday. They gave up Robert Williams, Malcolm Brogdon, a 2024 Golden State first, and a 2029 unprotected first of their own to the Blazers. I guess, what was sort of your first overall reaction when you saw the notification on your phone?
Oh shit, that's not good for the Sixers.
It is not good
for
the Sixers.
I expressed some concern on Boston's end right after it happened, kind of looking at the big picture, which we'll get to. But I think your immediate thought is they gave up their defensive ace on the perimeter in Marcus Smart to get Kristaps Porzingis, and then they end up getting Jrue Holiday to essentially fill that role.
Yep.
And Jrue can essentially be Marcus Smart without being a giant pain in the ass to his teammates, which I think is one of the big reasons that Smart was moved on. And, all the things we talked about the other day regarding swapping out Jrue for Dame in Milwaukee, now you get all those things in Jrue for a Celtics team that already has, long athletes on the perimeter in Tatum and Brown. You have Horford, who historically has been a very good playoff defender. Jrue now gives you, we don't say primary creation skills, but certainly like good secondary skills. Yep. And I do still think that Boston is maybe missing that one guy who can set things up for everybody. They're asking a bunch of guys who profile more as secondary team creators to cobble it together and combine into a primary initiator on their own. But I mean, look, they can put some absolutely ridiculous two-way lineups on the floor. He's a great character guy. It's like, the upside is tremendous on this move, right? I think now, if you were thinking after the Dame trade that Milwaukee is the clear favorite maybe in the East, I think this is like basically dead even if both sides are healthy, and it'll be an all-time playoff series if you can get Boston Milwaukee in a conference finals potentially. But all of this is to say it is bad news for the Sixers, was my first reaction.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to maybe like 2 weeks ago, go look in the PHLY Sixers channel. What a channel. We talked about the Celtics pretty extensively and how we thought that the Porzingis trade raised their upside, but it took away a decent amount of their team identity, and specifically their defensive identity, and being able to switch everything and really pester opponents on the perimeter. Well, now they got Porzingis to help spread the floor a little bit, maybe give them that rim protector, that traditional rim protector that they haven't always had, or at least that they haven't had when Robert Williams wasn't on the floor and they didn't play him for good chunks last year. So they got that rim protector, they got that floor spacer, and now they added that sort of like switchable, defensive menace on the perimeter in Jrue Holiday, who's also a more well-rounded offensive player than Marcus Smart is. So you look at, they don't have a traditional primary initiator. They didn't, when they beat the Sixers a couple months ago either. I think they have more initiators now than they did. Well, Brogdon was a big part of their half-court offense when he was on the floor. But they have so many two-way players and so much floor spacing now that you look at them and you go, all right, well, maybe you're just relying on the fact that Jason Tatum's job is now easier than it ever has been. And he can, the reads he'll have in front of him are easier. And also they should still be that dominant defensive force that they've always been. And you look at it and you go, well, shit. Like, the Sixers weren't competing with Boston and Milwaukee probably anyway. And after these two moves, like, if you were going to give the Sixers title odds, which seems preposterous at this point, it would be like 1%. And the 1% is like, shit happens. It's not any logical pathway. It's just weird stuff happens. Maybe if enough weird things happen to the Celtics, to the Bucks, to the Sixers, and maybe Maxey outshooting his potential or expectation, but there's a lot. It's not like a weird thing would have to happen. There's a lot of weird things that would have to happen. So that's certainly the first reaction. And the second reaction, when you look at it, like Portland getting a very useful young role player in Robert Williams, a guy in Malcolm Brogdon they can probably flip if they want to, if he can get back on the court. And there were reports that he could be back ready for the start of the season. Maybe, who knows, but he's currently injured. But at some point, you expect he will be back, and he'll probably have some value, maybe a little less because he has been very injury prone and there's real injury scares there.
Yeah.
Another player they can flip. And then 2 first-round picks. There was just no pathway to the Sixers beating that. And that's something that we have been talking about a lot in the last couple of days in studio, is that there's two problems with the Sixers acquiring Holiday. The first is that the Holiday trade was on a very different timeline than the James Harden trade. Like, there was a lot of momentum around the league, a lot of interest in making sure, as I'm saying this, the Eagles just tied it up. A lot of interest to get that Holiday deal done quickly. There wasn't the same kind of league-wide interest to get a James Harden deal done quickly. And the Sixers,
Right.
if they're gonna find a pathway, it had to include both of them. The timing was probably not going to line up. The second was there's just not enough interest in Harden to get the kind of assets to beat this. Like, you weren't getting a very good young player and a very good first-round pick for Harden right now. It's just not going to happen. So even if Daryl Morey had the appetite, this wasn't going to happen. And it's, on the one hand, I don't say that to give Morey an out. I say that to say that this just wasn't realistic at this time. And the reason it's not realistic is freaking infuriating. Like, you've got teams who have had enough talent on the floor to win a title and get to a finals, now make 2 blockbuster trades in the last week. And you're sitting here like, well, God, maybe if they can just get Terrence Mann. It's like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah,
like,
it's
what
crazy.
happened to it's infuriating. And I get that is completely infuriating. Meanwhile, the Sixers will be like, well, we're the one of only 3 teams to win a playoff round 3 years. Who fucking cares?
Who
Like,
cares?
nobody cares. Beat a good team in the playoffs and then talk your shit. And they're just so far away. And Joel Embiid sent out a tweet, something like, what an offseason, LMAO. I forget exactly what it is, but it was pretty close to that. And for him to say that, we're all like, yeah, all right, I get it. Like, this has been the offseason from hell. The offseason from hell.
I mean, you and I have been talking about this for a while, Derek, even prior to the podcast coming together. I don't think the Sixers understand.
Don't lie, Kyle. I never talked to you before. I hated you.
I don't think the Sixers understand how mad this fan base is and, what that's going to look like. I mean,
and here's what I'll say too. Like, I think they want to play it off like they want to push back on, just acknowledge that the fans have a reason to be upset. Just acknowledge that. That'll go a long way in Philadelphia. Like, they don't want to hear we won first rounds. They just don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that we're in a better spot. They don't want to hear any of that. They want you to be as pissed off as they are. And I get that a lot of people involved right now came in midway through. And I get that they were put in a tough spot. Like we just talked about before, that so many mistakes put them in a spot where Daryl Morey had to be basically perfect. And he hasn't been perfect. But acknowledge that, like, this is fucking infuriating. That you've got one of the best, 5 best players in franchise history. And you've had so many self-inflicted wounds over the years that the fan base is rightfully pissed off. Just acknowledge that instead of trying to tell us why we should be happy. It would go a long way. It would really go a long way.
People don't want to be pissed on and then told that it's raining. That's basically what it comes down to. I mean, you see at the Eagles game today, there are people flying banners saying, go away, Josh Harris. We don't want an arena. Obviously, that would have probably happened regardless because of the Commanders angle today. But I really don't think they understand just how deep they're in it with the fans right now. That people are ready to just throw this entire franchise in the trash. And honestly, a lot of that anger gets directed at Joel, right? Like you see Joel, who he has been part of the problem, right? Like the reason they haven't advanced further is not all his fault, but it's at least a good percentage his fault. And a lot of it is getting turned on him because he's the symbol of the team. We have a nice cat appearance on Derek's end. Look at that.
Long-time listeners of the Sixers will know that when we podcast remotely, she will probably be right.
So, yeah, look, they sort of just think, or they're carrying themselves in a way where they're suggesting, well, once they get out on the floor, everything's going to be fine. Like, I don't think that's the case, man. The Eagles are as good as they are. the Phillies, people are primed for them to go on another deep playoff run potentially. And, that's not a guarantee, but they've earned themselves some grace and some trust and some belief. And the Sixers have done none of that. And as you say, Derek, it's not all Daryl's fault or all Joel's fault. It's not all
It's not even
anyone's.
primarily, I don't think, but
Correct.
he is the current steward. Yeah.
But he is the guy running the team currently.
And he is this current steward who hitched his reputation and the team's future on a completely unreliable person too.
Exactly. He knew what he was getting into by getting back into the James Harden business, right? Like he knows James as well as probably anybody in the NBA. And he watched as for the second straight time, James burned his way out of town for a different team and said, well, he won't do that to us, essentially, by gambling on this guy. And as we've said previously, the thing I hold him most accountable for is the Harden situation going up in smoke, because he's supposed to be Mr. Star Hunter, big players are really all that matters. Well, then your job is to have an ironclad connection with these guys. I don't care what that takes. I don't care what you have to do. And that has completely crumbled this offseason. So that's a huge, huge problem. And they're now in a position where they have one of the best players in the NBA, a guy who just won the MVP. And people can credibly sit here on October 1st and say they're cooked. Like their season in terms of competing for a championship, as you said, Derek, relies on good fortune and good luck and a lot of different individual breaks happening. Like I pointed out when I first saw the trade, I was like, well, Boston is betting a lot on Porzingis staying healthy, essentially. They're one front court injury away from they're in a pretty rough spot, and I don't know how they would get themselves out of it. But if they do stay healthy, then like the Sixers have absolutely no chance to beat those guys in a real series without some significant trades being made. And the conclusion you ultimately come to is that James Harden basically has to show up and want to play for you for this season to be interesting at all. Like James Harden has to buy in. We saw with this trade, there was no real market. The Sixers were trying to get into 3-team trade talks with the Clippers and Blazers and try to figure that out to humor all parties. And because Boston was able to just offer more than the Sixers have, there was no shot to put that sort of deal together. It's not that the Sixers didn't
Boston
have interest.
Had full control of what they could offer. Yep.
Yeah. So it's not like the Sixers were not in on this, but essentially it comes down to at this point, if they're not willing to trade Maxey, they can't get into these talks. And they have not even been willing to include him in any of these talks. So you
don't trade Maxey for Jrue Holiday.
For sure.
We could certainly make a strong case that maybe they should have for Dame, but you don't for Jrue Holiday.
Yeah, no, it's completely defensible to not do it. But that being the case, that either means that a Harden trade has to essentially fall out of the sky that has not been available up to this point, or James has to walk through that door, realize himself, hey, I'm not getting a trade in the short to intermediate term if I don't buy in and show that I'm worth putting up with, essentially, like all the eccentric and trade demanding stuff. A team has to believe that they will get good James Harden and not the guy trying to light things on fire all the time.
So if I'm trying to reach, and trust me, this is reaching very far, for a positive takeaway here. Right now, if James Harden gets cut, just waived, wouldn't happen, just play with me here. If he gets waived, does that hurt James Harden more or the Sixers more? I think
James
pretty
Harden.
Clearly James Harden, because he loses his bird rights and he loses his chance to make not just like $30 or $40 million like he's hoping for. I'm not sure he's making $20 million next year if a team doesn't have his bird rights. Whereas the Sixers, if he comes in and he's a complete pain in the ass, which we still kind of expect him to be because that's just kind of James Harden. Like, there isn't a Morris twin that's going to come out here and make the Sixers a contender right now. And if he's a big enough pain in the ass where you can't even get a first round pick for him, then these Sixers aren't really losing anything if they do end up having to cut him. So I'm not saying Daryl Morey will cut him, but I'm saying they can make the case like, look, if you come in, you're too much of a pain in the ass, we'll cut you and you're fucked. And that has a lot more threat than maybe it did before, just because the market is so dead and he'll kill it even more. Maybe that's just enough of a credible threat where he doesn't go completely nuclear on the team. But, and this is a very key point, that would take a tiny bit of self-awareness from James Harden, and the guy who's paying women to hold up Daryl Morey is a liar sign while his highlights are playing in the background. I'm not sure that self-awareness is there. I'm
And
not
by
sure
the
he's
way,
going to look at this and say the trade market for me actually isn't strong. I think he probably believes Daryl Morey is just lying and dragging his feet.
as we're recording this podcast, Campaign just agreed to a deal with the Milwaukee Bucks. So it's just like more, not that Campaign is a world beater or anything, but it's just more salt in the wound, right? Like Sixers fans see, hey, Milwaukee got Dame Lillard, Boston gets Jrue Holiday, and then these teams continue to add more and continue
Yep.
chasing depth on top of that. And their team, as far as they can tell, is sitting on their hands saying, well, there's just nothing we can do. And the only person we have to blame is us. Like it's their fault. They've made all these. And this is part of why stability in management is so important. They went from Sam to Brian to Elton and the like weird shadow front office, and ownership is too involved. And now it's Daryl, and Daryl has made his own mistakes or his own, the trade for James.
How much say does David Heller has? How much does Brett
Yeah.
Brown have? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like don't get me started.
But that's what I mean. So all of this is a product of too many voices and too many different competing priorities. Hey, we're rebuilding and we're tearing it down, but no, we can't tear it down in that way. And then you try to accelerate it too quickly, and then you're trying to get cute in trades instead of taking a double, you're swinging for a home run and striking out and things of that nature. And
it's a low contact, low probability swing because you're so desperate.
yeah, and so they just don't have outs. And you see people saying, well, they should tear it down and rebuild and trade Joel. And look, I understand how hopeless people feel. I don't think people are really prepared for how far off the cliff this organization would go without having Joel. And to me, that's the big thing from today is Joel can say he's trolling and say he's doing whatever, but he is clearly not happy with the state of affairs right now. Just like Giannis in Milwaukee, who was saying, look, I need guys here who are all in trying to win a title. Joel sees Giannis's front office respond to that by getting fucking Dame Lillard. And he's like, oh, you signed Mo Bamba and Patrick Beverly and Kelly Oubre? Like, no disrespect to any of those guys. They're all fine basketball players in a vacuum. But when that's what you are getting and your direct rivals, the teams who are already ahead of you are getting all NBA, all-star level guys, Joel's going to throw up his hands and say, what the fuck is going on here?
And by the way, you weren't good enough before the offseason. Like, you weren't good enough. You weren't winning 3 playoff rounds to get to the finals. You're just not good enough. I will say, the more this offseason shakes out, the more maybe the cap space plan makes sense because it's their only fucking hope. It's their only, like, getting rid of your last remaining assets, which they couldn't even do anyway because that wouldn't have worked for either of these trades. At least here's a chance to recoup an asset or two, whether that's a tradable contract that you sign in free agency, or that's maybe getting some draft picks or young players to take on contracts. At least they have some flexibility. But boy, you're betting a lot on. I don't know. It'll be. I'll be fascinated to see what Boston does. I assume they didn't trade for Jrue Holiday to make him a rental, but it's going to be real tough for them to keep them around long term with those 4 big contracts. That will be fun. If not, maybe Jrue's a possibility next year, but there's a lot of ifs in that plan. They're really, really boxed in, and it sucks.
Yeah, and let's say they don't view this as a hopeless season and they're still looking for ways to try to supplement Joel. The deals that are going to be available to you are value rehab type deals, right?
Yep.
Where you look at somebody like Zach LaVine in Chicago, who it's clear that Chicago at this point does not love his contract and is looking for ways to get him off of the books. But through the Sixers, in an ideal world, you don't want that contract either for what Zach LaVine is. But if you want to take a talent swing and say, hey, maybe Zach just has enough upside as a number 2, sometimes pseudo number 1 playing off of Joel. There's certainly off-ball value there in addition to what he can do as a pick and roll creator, all that stuff. But you're talking about a guy who's got like constant knee problems, who's had serious injuries in the past, who, as we've discussed before, teammates do not always love playing with that guy. Doesn't have exactly a spotless reputation on that front. And then you'd also be putting him in a backcourt with Tyrese Maxey, and it'd be the ultimate Matador Olay defense for 4 quarters every night. So that's the sort of stuff that's going to be on the table. That, or maybe Toronto at some point finally decides we need to trade guys before their value is 0 and they leave for nothing in free agency. But I mean, Siakam and Nick Nurse's relationship, obviously not great, as by all accounts. They wouldn't trade OG Anunoby for Dame Lillard, so I doubt they're trading him for Tobias Harris or somebody like that. So you just go through the...
You don't know that, Kyle. They could value Tobias more than Dame.
Yeah, I mean, look, people are going to be desperate just to get somebody like Buddy Hield in here. And again, no disrespect to Buddy Hield, but Buddy Hield's not joining this team and taking them from a second round game 7 loss to a conference finals or finals appearance. Like it might be more aesthetically pleasing. It might be better for Joel in terms of offensive fit compared to some other guys, but not going to drive winning. And that's the kind of guys you're going to be able to get.
I mean, look, I guess the best source of optimism I can be is that if Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey find a way to pull this off, it will be a story for the ages. Not likely, but it would be one you would remember.
Yeah, maybe that's all we have.
As close as I can get.
It's Maxey and maybe Paul Reed on his new contract turns into a shooter, and really grasping at straws to try to sell hope and optimism at this very moment.
All right, I think that's probably just about all that I have. Just meant to be a reaction podcast. We will be back on Monday, coming to you after training camp, after media day. I mean, we will do a podcast there. Originally, that was going to be a lot about what we heard on media day. I would expect that there will be a little bleed over from this Jrue Holiday trade that we will talk about again on Monday before we head out to Fort Collins for training camp starting on Tuesday. But thank you, Kyle, and I will talk to you. I mean, gosh, it feels like you're the only one I really talk to every day, but I will talk to you very soon.
See you, buddy.